Well, hello everyone, and welcome back. It is time to kick off Season 7 of Future Ready's Leading Through Unprecedented Times. As many listeners know, we kicked off our very first episode of Season 1 2 weeks into the 2020 pandemic for one main reason: to give educators hope. 7 seasons later, we remain steadfast in our goal as we work to bring you spotlights of hope. And with each episode, we want to support your work by giving you access to some of our nation's leading practitioners and just forward-thinking minds. And I cannot think of a better way to kick off this season than by introducing Season 7's first guest, someone I've known and admired for many years, and that is the one and only Dr. Randy Watson, the Commissioner of Education in Kansas. Dr. Watson, how are you, my friend? It is so good to see you.
Tom, really great to see you again. 7 seasons. Thank you for finally asking me to be on the podcast. And Tom can tell you I've been begging. Tom, can we get on? Can we have this conversation together? Because we've known each other for such a long time. I've admired your work and really helping us push the envelope here in Kansas and across the country on how we better this job of helping kids become successful. So thank you.
Absolutely. And for our listeners, he's not kidding, just so you know. He stood in front of about 1,500 people and shared all of them that I should really ask him onto my podcast. And I'm not sure if he believes he was actually on my list for this season, truly, because I will tell you, watching Dr. Watson's work from afar, but also seeing him up close, I am so excited for this conversation as I've seen him lead his people firsthand throughout the state over the last number of years. And I'll tell you what, Dr. Watson, one thing I've always admired really about your leadership, especially having seen you at conferences and throughout the state, and you're always in school districts, is you get it. You understand. Like, you've worked in the trenches prior to rising to the state's top education post. And for listeners that may not know about your work, or maybe they're outside of Kansas and they don't get to see and travel like I do. And so share a little bit about your educational journey from where you started to how you become a state's commissioner of education.
Well, it's we all have interesting stories, right? And one of the things I like to tell young people, Tom, is when you're young and you're 8 years old or 16 years old and you're in school, someone else has written your story for you. You're just a product of whoever you were born to and whoever's raising you. And then if we really do this work really well, we can help formulate students writing their own story. So I grew up in Southeast Kansas, product of a broken home and raised by a single mom, and then some way found my way to Kansas State University. But my journey's all been in Kansas. Interesting enough, so I started in the smallest of Kansas schools, individual like senior class of 16. So we had classes of 15 to 20. It was in Tuscott, Kansas, where they said to me during the interview, Tom, hey, would you like to be the department chair? Yes, yes. Well, I was the only social studies teacher. So I coach boys basketball, coach girls volleyball, coach track, junior class sponsor, senior class sponsor, 7 different preps, no planning period, and just loved it. Just loved it. In fact, I still have so many connections from those years in Tuscott. My financial advisor that has all my retirement funds was a student. He and his wife were students of mine and athletes of mine. And then I went to a suburb of Wichita, and a fast-growing suburb, and taught and coached there in Andover, Kansas. And then after doing that several years, I became an assistant principal, then a principal, then assistant superintendent, and then a superintendent for a long time. And so I was being superintendent in McPherson, Kansas, and loved my job. I loved my community. We still live there. When former commissioner Andy Tompkins, someone I admire a great deal, said, you ought to think about taking this job. And I'm like, I see no path to be successful. I really didn't. We were in a very economic downturn. Teachers were really feeling bad. But Tom, I remember, as with your opening, standing in front of then the state board saying, we've lost hope in our state. Maybe what we can do is try to instill that hope again. with people, and that's what I've been trying to do. So that's 10 years ago now, Tom. I took this job, and in commissioners, as you know, like dog years, that's like 98. I'm one of the longest running commissioners. There's just a handful of us that have been here that long. It's a job that politically can be really intense, but a long intro to my life. I'm a native Kansan, and I try to get out. We have 286 school districts in our state. I visit every one of them at a minimum every 5 years. Try to do about 70 a year. Just got off of a little fall trip where I did 23 school districts where I go in, talk to faculty, listen to students, say, what do we need to do in Kansas? How can we help you be successful? So that's the story.
Yeah, no, I love it, and it's interesting because I get to be in so many different places, do so many different state conferences, and one thing that it truly every time I've seen you speak, walking off the stage, I love the impromptu conversations I get to have with superintendents or principals. Maybe they don't know of my connection to you, and every time, everywhere I go, the words I hear are, "He gets it." He understands, and I don't know, not to pick on any other states, but it's just different when I go there. And leadership is such a huge part of that. It's got to be so interesting for our listeners thinking about your work and your jobs. We have a lot of superintendents, a lot of principals that listen. On some days you probably find yourself sitting next to the governor. Some days you're in front of a legislature. Some days you're back in that small schoolhouse with 16 people. Going back to those days of tiny and rural, which is just such a vast array. But in your work, you also get to truly, as you said, give the state some hope, which I've seen you do firsthand, but you also help set some of the vision and some of the top priorities moving forward. So what are those things that are on your radar at least at the time of this recording, which is going to be a bit of time prior to actually release this, but what are some of the big priorities you have, the big buckets you're working on as a state?
So, Tom, we have a pretty compelling vision in our state that we will lead the world. So there's some metrics around what does lead the world look like. And then the second part of that vision in the success of each child. So two keys, success and each. So we're really focused on each child in their individual path through a pre-K through 12 school district. And so I've been trying to think throughout my career as to what do we need to do different to make sure that we hit that mark for each student, because as you know, they're so varied. They come from such varied backgrounds, varied experiences. So over the years, what I found is it's really simple. It's a really simple act of what we do in education, but it's really the execution of it can be very, very complex and complicated. So when you think about, in general, success going through school, it's relegated to two big buckets. The first is academic. You're going to need to learn to read. You're going to need to learn STEM skills, especially in Kansas. More than half of our good paying jobs are in STEM careers. And I think we'll probably talk some about that trajectory, a little bit later. So if you've got to learn math and science, and we want you to know the arts and we want you to be well rounded. So academics play a huge role. Um, I would argue in No Child Left Behind, though, at least what we did in Kansas, instead of focusing on the standards of academics, we focused on a test score. That's what we have to be cautious about, is test prepping just to get a score that doesn't really reflect that we have this depth of knowledge of academic. Second is then we call them Kansas Can competencies. The rest of the world calls them soft skills, employability skills, social and emotional skills. But it's this group of skills that we've known forever make up really successful people that for a long time we thought were born. Leadership would be one of those, right? Oh, well, you're either a leader or you're not. And now we know, no, those can be taught and they can be systematically taught. I think from when I grew up, they were probably reinforced and they were taught at home or through church and schools just reinforced it. Now we probably have to be more explicit in our teaching, kind of like we do reading. We have to be more explicit in our teaching. But those two big buckets, Tom, help students become successful. Now, there are a lot of components underneath that. And what I find is sometimes we just want to talk about the science of reading. We want to really get into that. And then we neglect maybe these other skills. Or, oh, well, it's cool to be in the social, emotional, or the workplace skill set. And let's not put any emphasis on learning some hard academic. You have to do both. And so then time becomes our enemy, and we have to think about how do we manage time to do both, and what are the structures that do that well. And still on that journey, trying to learn from a lot of people brighter than me on how to do it. But and then once we get to the late middle school, high school area, then we start talking about individual plans of study and how to help kids make that transition then from schooling to young adulthood.
Yeah, it's so refreshing to hear a state commissioner talk about all of those pieces, and how guilty we all can be of focusing or hyper focusing on certain things, certain metrics, and losing sight of all other things that really do matter in life. And so eloquently said, and really appreciate your vision. It's not an either or, it's an and, right? It's not the academics or the whole child social emotional side. It's the and we've got to make sure that we don't lose sight of that. Love, I've heard you talk about your idea around success and how do we define success. And I love that you intentionally use the word each. And I want to dive further into that as we think about, there's a lot of work nationally. We at All for Ed are doing a lot of federal policy stuff related to pathways and workforce, and just the pieces really around past graduation, post graduation, whatever that child wants to do. And I know that you started to touch on it a little bit at the end there. You've got a pretty unique vision of this in Kansas, but going back to each child to make sure that that he or she leverages their interests and their passions and their strengths for what they want to do. So talk to us about your vision around that, and the way that Kansas is working to prepare students post graduation.
Yeah, thanks. So Tom, what we want at the end, let's start with that end, is we want a student to graduate from high school. We find in our state, and I would argue this is true across the United States, not graduating from high school economically can really be a detriment into moving to good paying occupations and a structure of life that's going to allow you to be pretty happy because you're going to be struggling economically. Doesn't mean that there aren't some dropouts in high schools that do extraordinarily well, but they're the exception, not the rule. So graduate high school. And for us, we want you to go on, most of our students to go on to earn something beyond high school. That's your decision, which we'll get into the each in just a second. We call that post secondary effectiveness. So, am I going to technical school? Am I going to be an apprentice? Am I going into the military? Am I going to a 4 year college? Am I going to a 2 year college? What is my plan for some additional education? Because 73% of our job market in our state requires you to have a high school diploma in something else, Tom. And so, when we look at that, then we're trying to help kids figure that out. And so that goes back to those skill sets we talked about academic or the Kansas Can competencies. But as we think about each child, then, as students are, especially in middle school, well, I'll start in elementary. You can only be what you can imagine to be. And so most kids, when they're young, will say, well, I want to be a superhero, right? Or a fireman or a policeman or a teacher because they see those people or they see them on TV. When you get to middle school, it's really interesting when you ask kids, then I want to be a skateboarder, I want to be a gamer, I want to be an influencer, these things that they think, right? Or if they pick a kind of a hard occupation, I want to be a veterinarian because I love dogs and cats. And as you know, well, that's nice. You better love science and math if you're going to be a vet because it's hard to get in vet school than med school. But so we try to figure out for parents and for kids, what is it that's driving you? What courses do you like? What hobbies do you have? What interests do you have? You like to be outside. You like to work with your hands. You like to really help people. You really like to work with numbers and statistics. And where are those broad things? And then try to help them through selecting pathways in high school where they can experience those multitude of occupations within a pathway and then say, not for me. I thought I was going medical, don't like the blood, got to transition. I still want to help people, but it's not going to be in the medical field. Or they lock in, like my son did, and said, I know I'm going to be a 2D animator. Here's where I'm going to go to school to study that. And today he's pursuing that as a career.
Yeah, no, I love that and love the work then and enjoyed hearing you share about some of the visions around meeting each student where they are and then giving them the opportunities related to their strengths and their interests and love that work happening there as well. There's a couple pieces that you mentioned that I want to build on a little bit. One was really around leadership. And, as a former superintendent, going back to you get it, you see the needs. I also really enjoy the way Kansas, and it's a multi-tiered approach here for sure, supports its school and district leaders. When we look at pre-COVID, I believe superintendents were there. It was about 3.5 years was the average for a superintendent. We believe post-COVID, I saw one report, it's now under 3 years. I think no surprise. We get this leadership turnover, which creates some culture issues sometimes, or our vision becomes all over the place. What do you either recommend, or what's some of the work happening throughout the state to really support our school and district leaders so they can really take their vision, align it with the great work the state's doing? What recommendations do you have either for other states or for other groups that are also supporting school and district leaders? Because that's such a foundational aspect to the things that you're talking about.
Well, absolutely. Outside of the classroom teachers, the principal, superintendent, and all those support staff are the next factor of driving that success for each student. Tom, you're right. So we learned a lot of things from COVID. And many of those are good, and some of them are not good or bad. They just are reflections back to us. Uh, COVID was a tough time in education, tough time in a lot of occupations. And what we saw was a fairly large exodus of 55-year-old to 65-year-old teachers and leaders. And so when I go around, the veterans in our state are in their upper 40s, maybe approaching 50. There's not a lot of people in that older time frame because they left. So what's happened, Tom? I talked about my journey, and you could clearly see teacher for a long time, assistant principal, a principal, assistant superintendent. By the time I became a superintendent, I was well seasoned in education. So my trajectory was like this. And if you think about, Tom, we've positioned ourselves in leadership around two basic premises of preparing you to be a principal or superintendent, which is you get some education, a master's or a PhD, and then you get some time of which you are an understudy, if you would, of those positions. And then, or you're doing it in a really, really small school, and then you go to progressively larger schools. Those days are gone. We have now people that are going into our largest superintendencies, our largest principals, with very little work experience, very little teaching experience, very little leadership, if any leadership. And we're throwing them in a very complex world, Tom, that's heavy with social media and a lot of different challenges that we didn't have even pre pandemic. So we've completely rethought about leadership training from the master's and PhD programs to that we're going to have to develop people and we're going to have to simulate what experience did by training. And that's a theory of action. So we're trying to prove that out. But we are actually we've developed a system called the Kansas Exemplary Leadership Development System with our partners here in our state. That from the time that you say I want to be a leader in education to the time you retire, we've got you. We can provide training that just focused on what you need. We're providing coaching back to that person, and we're providing then advanced degree opportunities alongside in a package. And we're so excited about that because we think it will keep leaders in the positions. It will provide them some protection. It will give them, as I mentioned, some coaching when things are like, I don't get this. This is happening at me too fast. Because these are good people, Tom, that if they would have had a few more years under their belt before they took those positions, they would be fine. They didn't get that luxury. We had to move them more quickly into these positions. That's why you're seeing the average tenure washing out in 2 and 3 years, is because they're not that they're bad people. It's that they don't have the breadth of skills that are needed. We're going to help them so that 3 years can become 5 or 10 years, because that stability in schools of leadership, Tom, leads to those students being successful. When the turnover and the churn happens, too often school districts slide because there's no organization of where are we going and what are we trying to do.
Yeah, so well said. Just the structural pieces that happen around culture and just, again, the vision setting and the boards resetting visions with new superintendents. And sometimes it's no wonder teachers are like, well, what's coming next? Like, what's going to be next when we are changing so often? That stability in leadership is imperative. And kudos to you all. And I'll give a shout out to our friends at USA Kansas, the umbrella organization for superintendents and principals, and the work that they do throughout the state there as well. One other pieces that I want to ask, and kudos to you, as I think about leadership throughout the country, you are truly one of the most student-centered, student-focused people that I know. I was having a good conversation this morning with Rob Dixon, somebody that we know in Wichita, an incredible leader there, and he was talking about some of the work that they're doing, really leveraging student voice and getting into other new and different opportunities that are super relevant for today. What advice do you have around leveraging student voice, student interest, student passions? Because I know throughout the state, great things are happening in that area, as seen in my conversation this morning with Rob in Wichita. So, what advice do you have, or how can we tap into student voice? What does that look like, even as the commissioner who's going to schools literally every week? How do you tap into student voice to see where districts should go?
Well, of course, there's the formal ways I think we all think about it, right? Let's put so many kids on a committee, but then those are so few. While you're getting some voice, you're getting few voice. Well, I think what we want to do is branch in every school district beyond the student council voices. Not saying those aren't important; they are important. They take leadership roles, but every student should be given voice. And so, what we're trying to do, just like we did it when we attached our vision, is go to students and say, tell us about your school. What do you like? What do you want changed? What do you think about your future? Let me help you understand a little bit what that future looks like, because you can't quite see it yet unless your parents or someone in your immediate family is talking to you about it. And then trying to help students have all students have voice, because I think the way we've approached it in the past is some students have a lot of voice and many students have no voice. So we're trying to do that. We're actually just to give you an example, we have a little task force right now looking at personal devices in school and screen time, and that's co-chaired by a student in one of our really mid-sized school districts, more smaller rural districts, and we purposely put some students on there to try to elevate their voice, and let's help you make policy that students are going to live by in our state.
Yeah, no, I love that. I actually want to dive further into what you were just starting to talk about because there's so many hot button issues today with the rapid acceleration of AI and student cell phone use and ties to depression and ties to like the things that we're seeing out there with social media and all those pieces to the to screen time, right? Coming out of the pandemic and some parents saying like get them off the devices and put the paper and pencil. One of the things that I really admire and respect is you all aren't waiting for it just to come to you and just kind of hoping things go away. You're leading through task force and getting kids involved. Talk to us a little about some of those, how these task force that you're putting together are studying these issues, really thinking deeply about these issues, and not just being reactionary, but being really intentional in the work that you're doing with some of these hot button issues.
Well, you're right, Tom. It goes back to that pendulum swinging, between academics or social, emotional, or employability skills I talked about. The same thing kind of happens with hot buttons. So nationally or in a state, something gets pushed, and then all of a sudden, boom! It just takes off and it moves in a direction. So let's just use personal devices in school. Should they be allowed or not? We're seeing many states ban them by legislation without a lot of discussion around that. And so we decided, look, we're going to. We had a lot of voices along those lines too, and I said, well, why don't we get people together, including kids, and let's have kids lead this, students lead this, and let's have an honest discussion about what is the research telling us today and what does it not tell us, and then what is the appropriate use of technology? Because you and we couldn't live without our phone. I find it interesting we actually call it a phone, because if you look at your screen time, you're going to notice that most of it's not phone. But it's a terrific computing device that handles my schedule, handles my calendar. When I'm traveling, it tells me everything I need to go. I take notes on it. I give speeches off of electronic devices. Project off of it. It's a terrific device. But it also has a harming feature to it that can be used. So we're trying to, again, take thoughtful action. I think in my position, if I can sometimes buffer, sometimes it's hard because these tsunamis come at you, and you can say, let's slow down. What are your objections? What are you worried about in school? And then let's look at, is that really happening? And if it is happening, what do we need to do? And let's really study it. So, this task force will make a recommendation to our state board in November. Our state board will either take that or modify it and give some guidance out to school districts before we get out of the calendar year. But um, again, I think it comes back to, we want to make sure that voice is heard and that research is looked at. And I think oftentimes we're a soundbite, and a social media then you know takes that bite off. And in a presidential election year, you really see this happening nationwide.
Yeah, and at the time of this recording, by the time this actually plays, some of those pieces will come through, and so we're
That's
going to
right.
see where that actually goes. And one of the things, just as I listen to you speak on that I respect, at a time with such culture wars and mudslinging across the board on all sides, you're really being intentional at looking at all sides of an issue. Because, like you said, things like cell phones, they in themselves, they're agnostic. They just they can be used for really good. They can use for really bad. Let's talk about all sides of it, right? And I think sometimes we've lost a little bit of that in our country, and just the opportunity to be intentional in that conversation. By the way, to also have conversation with those like children that it impacts, to make sure they're part of the conversation, not just something that's done to them. So, Dr. Watson, I have one final question for you. I always love to ask at the end here. You get to see so much. You get to be all over the place. As you mentioned, you're in about 70 schools a year, all across the board. For our listeners here, what's one piece of advice that you have from your heart, regardless of their position? Maybe it's a teacher, a first-year superintendent, a 30th year principal, no matter where they are in their journey and their career. What's one piece of advice that you have for them moving forward?
My grandmother, Tom, was the matriarch of our family, and she did a great job of making sure that her kids and her grandkids, of which I was one, celebrated every birthday. And we were a close knit extended family. I mentioned I had a single mom, but a close knit extended family. She sat all the grandkids down, and one time and said, my grandmother's a product of the Depression. She said, you're going to go to college because that's going to give you a better education. I don't care what you study, but you may want to think about being a teacher. It's a noble, it's an honorable profession, and it still is. And we have the opportunity in that noble and honorable profession to impact the lives of kids forever. And we should never lose focus of that. And when you keep that as your focus, yes, they compensate me for doing this job. It's really wonderful. But I get the opportunity to work with people to try to make that happen in our state every day, Tom. And for everyone that tune in, and you have a lot of people that do because you're so well respected, that's what we always have to keep. And if you lose that, maybe it's time that you look at doing something else. Keep that burning. Find people that will help you burn it inside of you, and keep going forward.
Well, everybody, that is the one and only Dr. Randy Watson. Randy, my friend, it has been such an honor, such a privilege to connect yet again with you. On behalf of Future Ready Schools, thank you for your leadership. Thank you for being such a model of wisdom and intentionality, and just all the work that you're leading. Keep leading the way, and keep taking care of those in Kansas. We appreciate you, my friend. It's been great to have you on.
Well, thank you, Tom. And I appreciate your work so much. You're really doing wonderful work across the country.
Thanks so much.